A soldier from Earth had just rescued the alien queen's daughter, only to be greeted with an unexpected proposition. The sky above Xeris was ablaze, though that wasn't anything unusual. Plasma storms swirled in lazy patterns, crossing the ashen sky, their bright trails pierced by anti-orbital fire. Below, the ground trembled as something large erupted far off. Could have been a tank, maybe an unfortunate livestock caught in the blast. Hard to tell, but for Sergeant Lee Carson, it didn't matter. He was buried deep in the wreckage, struggling with the crumpled remains of a Thershian transport vehicle. The once powerful personnel carrier now looked like a crumpled soda that had been crushed by some cosmic force. The heads-up display on his helmet flickered urgently, warning of dangerously low oxygen levels, ammunition reserves hanging by a thread, and his morale somewhere between sheer panic and a mild case of exhaustion. He ignored the warnings, gritting his teeth as he pried open the hatch of the mangled transport. The mission had been simple, a reconnaissance sweep. In and out, grab the beacon. No complications, no surprises, no royalty. But then he freed the last bolt, and the softest that came from within was mechanical. It wasn't the sound of cooling systems or hydraulics, but the sharp hiss of something very much alive and furious. That's when he saw her. She crouched behind a shattered stasis pod, holding a small, strange creature, a furry thing with one glowing eye and an unsettlingly cheerful grin stitched across its face. The little girl's skin was a soft shade of lavender, bruised from the debris and dotted with cuts. She was about the size of a human child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, but the long, pointed ears poking out from her tangled hair screamed that she wasn't from Earth. Her large, luminous eyes met his, filled with suspicion and a hint of mischief. Then she snarled, showing tiny, sharp teeth, and hurled a twisted piece of metal at him. It clinked harmlessly off his helmet. "Back, Earth scum!" she screeched in flawless universal galactic basic. "I am Princess Lyra of the Thershian Ascendancy. Touch me, and you will suffer the wrath of 1,000 generations of royal vengeance." Lee blinked. "Well," he muttered to himself, "you're definitely not from a mailroom." Before he could respond, a nearby explosion shook the ruins, followed by the crackling voice on his comms. "Carson, we got evac incoming in 6 minutes. You find anything?" Lee ducked as Lyra, apparently deciding to use a broken holoplayer as a weapon, nearly took his head off with a wild swing. "Found a princess. Very stabby. 10 out of 10 attitude." There was a long silence on the other end. Then, "Please tell me that's code for a broken data core?" "Negative," Lee replied, dodging another throw from Lyra as she now tried to wield a plasma cutter upside down. Small sentient threat level. Emotionally volatile. Another explosion rocked the ground. This one closer. Lee looked at the alien girl again, who was now growling while attempting to fix a piece of tech with the precision of a drunken mechanic. She was scared, injured, and if she didn't have his help, those approaching Thershian kill drones would end her quickly. Sighing, Lee lowered his rifle, pulled off his helmet, and looked at her. "All right, Your Highness. Rule number 1 of surviving this hellhole: don't die. Rule number 2: trust me to get you off this rock, and I'll throw in a chocolate ration." Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Is that the brown, rectangle thing that smells like despair?" Lee nodded, solemnly. "That's the one." With an exasperated huff, she tucked the fuzzy creature under her arm and limped toward him. "Fine, but if you betray me, I'll have your spleen turned into a diplomatic appetizer." "Noted," Lee said, scooping her up and heading toward the evac site. As he dodged plasma bolts and navigated a particularly judgmental crater, Lyra leaned in close and whispered, "My mother's going to vaporize you." "Oh," he asked, ducking behind a jagged rock as the drone zipped overhead. "She doesn't like humans," Lyra said helpfully. "She says you smell like old soap and rebellion." Lee chuckled despite himself. "Can't argue with that." The dropship arrived, its thrusters howling through the smoke and debris. Lee dashed the final 50 meters, Lyra clinging to his vest like a particularly sarcastic backpack. His squad stared at him as though he'd grown a second head. "What the hell is that?" Corporal Juarez demanded as he stumbled aboard. "Royal baggage," Lee wheezed, collapsing into a jump seat. "Do not poke her." Lyra smiled sweetly and held up her plush companion, which was still glowing menacingly. The hatch sealed, and the ship roared upward, breaking through the atmosphere, leaving a trail of scorched air behind. As Lee finally allowed himself to breathe, Lyra settled beside him, watching the stars reappear through the viewport. "You're not entirely useless," she said grudgingly. "Thanks," Lee replied, rubbing a fresh bite mark on his shoulder. "That means a lot coming from someone who just tried to sell my spleen." She smiled, sharp but not unkind, as the moon of Xeris burned behind them. Lee couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He didn't know exactly what he had started by saving her, or what kind of empire he had just stepped into, but one thing was for sure. He really needed a shower, and maybe another chocolate bar. Lee Carson had expected to be shot the moment he stepped foot on the Royal Xerixian flagship. Not ceremonially shot, just the regular kind, the chest kind. Twice, maybe with an alien plasma weapon that boiled your insides and smelled like burnt fruit. Instead, he was met by a battalion of silver-armored guards who regarded him as though he were a bad odor that had been dragged across a velvet rug. One of them even sniffed. "You smell like rust and carbohydrates," the guard muttered in their native tongue. "I get that a lot," Lee replied, adjusting his field uniform. Princess Lyra stood beside him, still holding her plush one-eyed beast, which now wore a tiny cape she'd fashioned from a trauma blanket. She didn't seem particularly fazed by the grandeur of her surroundings, probably because she had grown up in it. Lee, on the other hand, was struggling not to gawk at the floating columns, the walls made of solidified starlight, and the faintly glowing vapor that seemed to whisper news headlines when it brushed past his ear. They were led through winding corridors and anti-gravity lifts, passing holographic guards that watched, bowed, and somehow judged silently all at once. It felt like walking through a museum designed by people who viewed subtlety as a weakness. When they finally arrived, the doors didn't slide open. They glowed open, tall and arched, made of translucent obsidian shimmering with galaxy maps. Two guards stepped aside in synchronized disdain as Queen Jara stood in the center of a platform hovering above a sea of light. A crown of thin golden wire spun around her head, seemingly of its own accord. She wore a robe that looked like molten chrome, and her smile suggested she was trying out civility for the first time, but wasn't entirely convinced. Lee saluted awkwardly. "Sergeant Lee Carson, ma'am. Brought your kid back, mostly intact." Lyra elbowed him as Queen Jara's eyes glowed like the aftermath of a solar flare. "You disobeyed military orders, endangered your squad, interfered with royal extraction protocol. Also, you gave her half my water and let her use your helmet as a dollhouse." Lee added helpfully, "which, by the way, is now full of glitter and crumbs." The Queen's smile didn't falter. "And yet you returned her to me unharmed." Lee shifted, a bit uncomfortable. Was kind of hoping for a thank you or maybe a souvenir. Jara descended from the platform, gliding with eerie grace. She stopped just inches from Lee, examining him as though he were an interesting specimen. "Human, you fascinate me." "That's either flattering or terrifying," Lee muttered. "Possibly both," she replied, her gaze never leaving him. "You saved something precious to me. For that, I owe you a debt." Lee scratched the back of his neck. "I mean, a medal would be fine. Maybe a fruit basket? Something that doesn't come with politics or lasers." Lyra giggled, hopping to stand next to her mother. "He told me if I screamed again, he'd invent a new swear word, which I did." Lee muttered, "Flar noble. Look it up." Jara turned and gestured gracefully, causing a holographic map of the galaxy to bloom in midair. The Xerixian territories lit up in shades of blue and silver, while human-controlled sectors appeared far fewer, flickering in desperate red. "The war has reached a turning point," Jara said, her voice sharp and low. "There's an opportunity, small and delicate, for a new direction, one that requires a symbol. Someone unexpected, someone both sides can view as other." Lee frowned. "Wait, you want me to be a symbol?" "I once tried to put my pants on backward in zero gravity and got stuck for 3 hours," Lee added dryly. "That was pretty symbolic." "You intrigued the masses," Jara said, her voice still calm. "A soldier with no agenda. A rescuer who should have left. You could be useful." Lee paused. "Useful?" How? A liaison, an advisor, a voice in the Empire at my side. Lee nearly choked. Wait, hold on. You're not proposing. She raised a brow, her eyes glinting, not romantically, although we do share genetic compatibility at a 72% threshold. That's oddly specific. And deeply uncomfortable, Lee muttered. I ran the numbers during your descent, Jar replied. Of course you did, Lee groaned. The offer hung in the air, absurd and enormous. A human soldier in the heart of an alien empire. The war could shift. Peace, something like it, might follow. Or maybe it was a trap, so complex it made his head hurt just thinking about it. Before he could process it further, the door hissed open. An older Thershian male burst in, robes askew, panting heavily. Urgent communication from Sector 9, he cried. The rebellion has struck the Gravity Farms. Lee turned slowly. Did he say Gravity Farms? Yes, Jar replied, where we grow gravity. Lee blinked. Yep, I need a drink, and possibly a therapist. Lyra tugged on his sleeve. You'll be fine. Just don't let anyone offer you blue pudding. It's alive. And with that, Sergeant Lee Carson officially became the first human ever invited to sit in a Thershian council meeting. He really hoped the chairs had lumbar support. The council room was alive with energy, the hum of debate and the soft pulses rattling through Lee's teeth as the officials argued over rebel attacks and galactic peace treaties. He stood in the center, caught between being a diplomat and an unwitting bystander to the surreal dynamics of Vraxian governance. Meanwhile, he skillfully avoided being caught up in any political assassination attempts, which, oddly enough, were being conducted by a buffet table of floating snacks. A gravity-defying wheel of food spun slowly near the back wall, offering all sort of oddities, some which appeared harmless, others a bit more lively. One particular snack blinked at him. Don't, Lyra warned in a low voice, appearing suddenly at his elbow. She was dressed in a formal diplomatic tunic, her expression a mix of exhaustion and knowing far too much for her age. That one tries to mate with your tongue. Lee instinctively took a step back. She glanced up at him. You're doing okay. Mother hasn't threatened to execute you yet. Well, that's oddly encouraging, he said, his tone dry, when suddenly an emergency transmission flickered into the chamber. A rebel broadcast, grainy and chaotic, played out across the air. A weathered, scarred human face appeared, one that Lee recognized all too well. Dane, the voice rasped. If you're seeing this, it means the Vraxians haven't killed you yet. We know what they offered. We know what Jera's planning. She's not after peace. She wants control. You're not their guest. You're their puppet. Don't play their game. Help us. We need someone inside. The message ended abruptly, static taking over, followed by a heavy silence. Jara, standing at the center of the room, didn't move, but the intensity in her gaze was enough to freeze the air. The rest of the council members turned their eyes to Lee with renewed suspicion, as if he'd sprouted extra limbs or confessed to some untold betrayal. Lyra tilted her head. That was your friend. Lee swallowed hard. Former commander. Used to yell at me for double dipping the rations. Jera's voice cut through the tension like a razor. You will explain this. Lee scanned the room, feeling the weight of alien eyes pressing in on him. Less than a week ago, he had been a simple soldier, focused on surviving. Now, he found himself caught between the familiar past and a dangerous future. He forced a smile. You ever get the feeling you're the only guy at a party who didn't read the invitation's fine print? There was no laughter, not even from the moss beneath him, which had stiffened, as though preparing to launch itself into the nearest star. For the first time, Lee felt a cold chill run down his spine. Welcome to diplomacy, he thought. Lee had always believed in being honest. Right after following the rules about not licking alien batteries and avoiding overly friendly customs agents. But standing here, in the heart of a Vraxian war room, flanked by beings who could obliterate him with a thought or drown him in bureaucratic paperwork, he was starting to reconsider those life philosophies. The walls flickered with war maps, planets marked in pulsating red, star routes tangled with skirmish data. The holographic fleets moved in calculated patterns, like predators circling prey. At the center of it all, the message from the human resistance replayed, its words looping like an annoying, guilt-laden ringtone. "We need someone inside." Lee rubbed the back of his neck, glancing at Queen Jara, who was perched on her throne once more, her long ears twitching ever so slightly. He had learned that was a Vraxian sign for mild to moderate homicidal irritation. "I swear I didn't know they would broadcast that," Lee muttered, his voice strained. "We haven't exactly been exchanging holiday cards." Jara's voice was cold, though still measured. "Your former commander knew exactly where you were. That implies surveillance, coordination, possible infiltration, possible embarrassment," Lee added. "I mean, the guy called me a puppet. That's just rude." Counselor Velk, a skeletal figure with translucent skin and a voice like a malfunctioning airlock, barked. "This is not a joke. This message undermines your position. It endangers our peace plans." Lee raised both hands in mock surrender. "Look, I get it, but I didn't invite the rebellion to hijack your galactic broadcast network. I'm just a guy who saved a princess and occasionally burns toast in the diplomatic lounge." Lyra piped up, materializing at his side like a mischievous shadow. "Actually, he taught the food synthesizer how to make pancakes. They're weird, but they're addicting." Jar shot a glance at her daughter, a mixture of fondness and quiet horror. "Your loyalty to the human is noted, though misplaced." "He gave me syrup," Lyra said solemnly. "You don't betray someone who gives you syrup." Lee gave her a quick thumbs up. Finally, someone who understands the ancient law of breakfast. Despite the exchange, the tension in the room was palpable. Even the moss beneath Lee had grown uncomfortably stiff. Jara finally stood, her voice cold with authority. "The situation is unstable. We must determine your loyalty, Sergeant Carson." Lee glanced around, trying for bravado, but it came out sounding more like he was trying to swallow a moth. "Blood sample? Brain scan? Karaoke night," without smiling. Jara gestured toward a tall metallic capsule that materialized from a beam of light above. "Enter. It's a thought resonance chamber. We'll review your memories, analyze your intent, observe your actions through neural recall." Lee stepped back, raising an eyebrow. "Okay, so brain karaoke?" Lyra leaned in closer, her voice conspiratorial. "It tingles. Also, don't think about clowns. They get amplified." "Great. Fantastic," Lee muttered, stepping into the chamber. The door sealed behind him with a hiss, and the world around him went quiet. For a moment, it was like standing on Xeris again, surrounded by smoke, heat, and chaos. But this time, he was a mere observer, watching himself dive into the wreckage, hearing his own voice echoing back at him, raw and unfiltered. "We don't leave kids behind. I don't care what species they are." The memories shifted, and flashes of a squad filled his mind. The dropship, Lyra biting his shoulder mid-flight. Then, another scene earlier, hushed voices in a resistance tent. The same commander from the broadcast, speaking in a low voice. "The Varaxians won't stop until they have absorbed every system. If they offer you anything, it's a trap. Smile, accept, then detonate from within." Lee flinched, remembering the warning that he'd either forgotten or deliberately pushed out his mind. The chamber went dark, then light again. When the door opened, Jar was standing there, waiting for him. "Well," Lee asked, stepping out, his heart racing, "did I pass your science fiction polygraph?" She studied him for a long moment, her gaze piercing. "You're conflicted." "Tell me something I don't know," Lee muttered. "You seek peace but fear betrayal. You've lived in war for so long, you mistake survival for strategy." "That sounds like a fortune cookie I once got," Lee said, brushing mist off his jacket. "Except the cookie tried to bite me." Lyra giggled softly. Jara turned to address the council, her tone shifting to something more measured. "The human is not without flaws, but he speaks truth. His intentions, though muddled, are not treacherous." The chamber rippled with a collective sigh, just enough for Lee to allow himself to exhale. Then, as if the universe was determined to maintain its impeccable timing, the warning sirens blared. "Unscheduled breach. Hangar Bay Theta." Multiple life signs. Armed. Jera's eyes narrowed. The rebellion. Wait. Lee blinked. Here. Lyra handed him his sidearm, as casually as a waitress offering extra condiments. Welcome to the Empire. Hope you brought ammo. He hadn't, but he did bring sarcasm, and at least that was loaded. The firefight in Hangar Bay Theta was nothing short of a galactic food fight. If the food was high-powered plasma, and the pies were heat-seeking. Lee dove behind a stack of Raxian energy crates, which, according to their glowing red glyphs, were either explosive ordnance or an aggressive form of alien cheese. Above, rebel ships puncture the force field with precision strikes, slipping in like interstellar eels. Human operatives spilled into the hangar, shouting coded phrases and ducking behind transport haulers, their armor gleaming with makeshift insignia and burnt flags. In the middle of it all, Jar moved through the chaos like a storm goddess sculpted from moonlight and malice, her ears flicking as she gave orders in a language that sounded like collapsing metal. Even in the middle of an invasion, her posture screamed, "Try me. I dare you." Lee was about to join the fray when Lyra appeared beside him, holding an alien weapon that seemed far too large for someone who had once tried to ride a medical droid like a pony. "You said they wouldn't come," she said, her voice a mix of betrayal and awe. "I said they shouldn't come," Lee replied, flashing a grim smile. "Big difference." "You humans are very good at saying things that end up being wrong," Lyra muttered. He offered a rueful grin. "We call it optimism, or bad luck." Together, they moved from cover to cover, firing only when necessary. Lee was careful not to hit anyone he recognized, which was hard, seeing as most of his old squad was either posturing like they were in a space soap opera or trying to overthrow a monarchy. Rebel leader Commander Harlan appeared in the haze, his scarred face glaring through his visor. "Carson," he barked, "you're coming with us. We got a clean extraction window in 10 minutes before this place locks down." Lee looked at him, then at Lyra, and finally at the Queen, who was currently disarming 3 rebels with what looked like a decorative scepter and an extreme lack of manners. "I can't," Lee said. Harlan's eyes narrowed. "They've brainwashed you." "No," Lee replied, "but they did run a memory resonance scan, which is kind of like therapy, but with more lasers. Point is, this isn't the same mission anymore. What are you talking about?" Harlan demanded. "I'm talking about a chance to end the war without turning the galaxy into a barbecue pit. Jar wants peace. Real peace, not the let's hold hands while stabbing each other in the back kind." "And you believe her?" Harlan scoffed. "I believe her, kid, and I believe I've seen enough blood to last 3 lifetimes." Harlan said nothing for a long moment before raising his blaster. "Sorry, Sergeant. Can't risk it." Before he could fire, a pulse bolt knocked the weapon clean out his hand. Jar stood behind him, her scepter sizzling. "That was not a request," she said, her voice ice cold. Lee sighed. "Thanks again." Jar gave him a sideways glance. "You remain inconveniently durable." The rebels were rounded up, not killed, but detained with surprising amount of dignity. Lee insisted on it, and Jar allowed it for now. It was a start. 2 standard weeks later, the capital of the Zerixian Empire had undergone a drastic transformation. What was once a city defined by polished paranoia and deadly architecture now bore banners of unity. New councils were being formed, human representatives were appointed, and rebel prisoners were released. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it wasn't a war zone either, and that was a win by galactic standards. Lee stood on a high balcony, overlooking the starport, sipping a fizzy green drink that was supposed to taste like lemonade but mostly reminded him of guilt and lime. Lyra joined him, now dressed in something that might have passed for royal armor if it hadn't been half covered in doodles. "One shoulder has a painted Earth flag," she said, "and the other a cartoon pancake with crown. Mother says she's rewriting the peace treaty," she added. "She keeps using your sarcastic tone in the phrasing." Lee raised his glass. "I'll take that as a compliment. She also said she might not vaporize your planet." Lyra smiled. "Small miracles." There was a beat of silence before Lyra spoke again. "I heard you turned down the title." "Yeah," Lee replied. "Grand human emissary of not getting shot was a bit much." So, what now? Lyra asked. Lee exhaled slowly, watching the ships lift off toward newly opened skies. Now I stay. Help build something worth keeping. Translate a few idioms. Teach the council not to hold meetings at 0400. And maybe start a pancake shop. Lyra laughed. You're weird. I get that a lot. Behind them, Queen Jar approached, wearing no crown, just a simple tunic of dark silver. Her long ears were half tied back in a diplomatic bun. You've complicated everything, she said, no preamble. It's a gift, Lee replied, and yet it's working. I'm just as surprised as you are, Jar said, glancing at Lyra before turning her gaze back to Lee. We may still face war. Old wounds do not vanish in a fortnight. No, Lee agreed, but someone's got to be first through the door. Might as well be the guy with the dumb jokes and good pancakes. Jar nodded slowly. You remain inconveniently human. Lee grinned. And your inconveniently started to sound like one. Above them, the stars pulsed, and the moon of Xeris remained scorched in the distance, a reminder, not a tomb. And in the heart of an empire once built on fear, a strange new alliance flickered into being. It was flawed, it was fragile, but it was real,